The gunshot came before any word could save her. Officer Derek Blaine raised his weapon and fired directly into Dr. Elena Ramirez's chest at point-blank range, the sound cracking through the quiet space with a violence her daughter would never forget. The impact drove Elena back as if the air itself had struck her, tearing through the flag patch on her shoulder and breaking the promise of safety she had carried home from every battlefield she survived. Her hand slipped from 10-year-old Mia's fingers as the life she had fought so hard to protect began to drain across her uniform. Blaine didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He acted with the cold certainty of a man who believed he had the right to decide who looked like they belonged in a soldier's uniform and who did not. His weapon stayed raised even as Mia fell beside her mother, pressing her small hands against the wound, begging someone, anyone, to help. Elena fought to stay upright, but her body weakened faster than her will, and she collapsed to her knees with the stubborn dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to bow for injustice. The silver dog tag engraved with S-72 slid from her collar and struck the ground with a soft, final sound. A sound that meant far more than Blaine understood. As Mia clutched her mother's chest, her thumb brushed the hidden stud beneath the metal plate. The click was quiet, but the signal it sent was not. Omega Sentinel had awakened. Before going into this story, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments so we can see how far this story reaches. And while you're here, please subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps more than you know, especially with stories that matter. The moment the shot was fired, the world shifted in ways Blaine never imagined. Elena had walked out of the Dallas VA Medical Center only minutes earlier, exhausted from her therapy appointment, but trying her best to keep her promise to Mia. She had told her daughter they would stop for ice cream on the way home, a small ritual that helped soften the weight of memories she carried from Afghanistan. Elena's uniform was clean because she wore it only on days when courage felt thin, and she needed to remind herself of every life she had saved. She wasn't on duty. She wasn't a threat. She was a mother trying to reclaim one peaceful afternoon. But Blaine didn't see a surgeon who had patched up American soldiers under mortar fire. He didn't see the woman who stayed behind during a collapsing shelter to save 3 wounded Marines. He saw someone he decided didn't belong. Someone he chose to confront. Someone he would later claim had moved wrong, even though she hadn't moved when he first approached. Elena shifted her body to keep Mia behind her, a reflex sharpened across decades of combat medicine. She greeted him calmly, offering respect even before he offered hostility. She said, "I'm retired Army Medical Corps, Colonel Ramirez," and handed over her identification with a steady hand. Blaine flicked it aside without looking, as if her record, her years of service, her sacrifices, all meant nothing. "Uniform looks brand new," he muttered. "Where'd you steal it?" The words cut deeper than he understood. Elena had worn that uniform when she treated wounded soldiers who cried out for their families. She wore it when she held pressure on a 19-year-old's artery for 40 minutes. She wore it when she saved Blaine's own chief's brother in Fallujah. But Blaine saw only the story he brought with him, a story built on suspicion and entitlement. He ordered her to her knees. She refused because the child at her side needed her to stay standing. Her refusal was not defiance. It was protection. But Blaine interpreted dignity as resistance and escalated with the reckless confidence of a man who believed consequences were for other people. The shot broke through the afternoon in a way that would replay in Mia's mind for the rest of her life. The force drove Elena backward, her hand reaching out instinctively toward her daughter even as her strength failed. Mia dropped beside her, her small voice shaking as she called out, "Mom, stay with me!" pressing her hands over the wound the way she had seen her mother do for others. Elena tried to speak, but only a faint breath escaped. One final act of presence for her daughter. Blaine stepped back, not out of remorse, but out of shock that his own anger had taken him this far. He looked at his hands as if the weapon had fired itself. He reached for his radio, fumbling for a version of events that could be defended. But the world was already moving faster than he could imagine, because when Mia's thumb pressed the hidden stud beneath Elena's dog tag, a classified beacon sent a signal across a network built for only one scenario: the death of Sentinel-72. Omega Sentinel did not wait for confirmation. It did not request authorization. It did not warn the local police. It triggered the highest-level military response allowed on American soil when a decorated service member was killed through unlawful force. Cameras around the lot began shutting down in a synchronized blackout. Cell signals within the immediate area began to scramble. And 160 miles south, in an underground wing at Fort Cavazos, Colonel Marco Ramirez looked up from his console as the symbol tied to his sister's code began flashing. He had seen alerts before. None were this color. None were this loud. None were meant to be ignored. Back in the parking lot, Mia tried to lift her mother's head, whispering words that carried the weight of a child's first experience with irreversible loss. She looked up at Blaine with a mixture of terror and disbelief, unable to understand why a man with a badge had done this to someone who spent her life saving others. Blaine stood frozen, realizing too late that this was not a routine stop gone wrong. This was the beginning of something he could not control. Elena's final breath left her lips as the faint echo of rotor blades began to build in the distance. Too low, too fast, too coordinated to belong to anything local. Mia didn't know what Omega Sentinel meant. She only knew she had done what her mother told her to do if the unthinkable ever happened. If they ever kill me for my skin on American soil. Elena had once written, "Wait for the truth to arrive, then scream." And now the truth was coming, carried on the wings of a system that had been asleep for years, waiting for this exact moment. The consequences for Derek Blaine, for Chief Harlan Voss, for Mayor Lydia Grant, and for every hand that buried the truth, were no longer optional. Omega Sentinel was awake, and nothing would stop what came next. The moment Omega Sentinel activated, the response unfolded with the precision of a system built for only one terrible purpose: at Fort Cavazos, deep beneath a restricted wing few soldiers knew existed, Colonel Marco Ramirez stared at his console as the red alert pulsed with the unmistakable signature of his sister's code, Elena's identifier. S-72 was not supposed to appear under the heading now flashing across his screen, Omega Sentinel Breach. Marco's breath tightened as he realized the alert could only be triggered one way. The system had been designed for catastrophic loss, for the death of an asset whose work and identity were so classified that her protection did not end with retirement. Omega Sentinel was not for rescue. It was for response. And it meant his sister had been killed in a way that violated every treaty, every protocol, and every agreement between the military and civilian authorities. Across the room, technicians looked toward Marco with the same stunned silence, knowing that whatever came next would alter the chain of command across the entire region. Marco issued the activation command with a steady voice that betrayed nothing, even though every part of him was breaking. Initiate blackout. Dispatch Sentinel teams. Lock camera grids. Airborne units. Launch. The words traveled through secure channels with a speed unmatched by anything used for routine operations. Within 8 seconds, every camera in the Dallas VA parking lot went offline, swallowed in a synchronized blackout that looked like a glitch to anyone watching from the outside. To those inside the system, it was a declaration. Omega Sentinel was fully awake. In the sky above Central Texas, 3 black helicopters with no numbers, no insignia, and no visible navigation lights turned toward Dallas with a precision reserved only for missions labeled Eyes Only. Their rotors cut through the air with a low thunder that signaled the arrival of something the public was never meant to see. On the ground at the VA lot. Paramedic Jake Morales sprinted toward the body he recognized even before he knelt beside it, the moment he saw Elena's face. Memories rushed back from Afghanistan, the day she saved his life with her bare hands when all medical supplies had been destroyed in a blast. He touched her shoulder, hoping to feel any sign of pulse, but her body told him the truth with a final, irreversible stillness. He noticed the Omega Medic Group insignia on her sleeve, a symbol he had seen only once during his deployment. He felt the weight of danger settle across his chest as he realized he was not looking at an ordinary casualty. He pulled out his phone and recorded 30 seconds of video, documenting the blood, the position of her body, Mia's hands still pressed against the wound, and the empty stare of Officer Derek Blaine, whose gun remained raised even as help arrived. Jake's recording captured Blaine's attempt to reach for his radio. But before he could speak, a dark vehicle slid to the edge of the lot. Two men in black suits stepped out with an authority that silenced the scene. They moved with a calm that signaled training far beyond local jurisdiction. One placed a hand on Blaine's shoulder and said nothing, but the officer's expression shifted from confusion to fear. The man's presence alone was enough to make Blaine lower his weapon without protest. It was not a request. It was a message. Blaine looked into the man's eyes and realized he had already been removed from whatever story he planned to tell. The other operative walked toward Mia with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the severity of the moment. He lifted the trembling child into his arms as if she weighed nothing, wrapping her in a protective cloth that hid her face from the growing number of stunned officers arriving at the scene. The helicopter blades became louder, sweeping dust and fear into the air as the operatives stepped back. The crime scene tape flapped wildly in the rotor wash before snapping against the poles with sharp, rhythmic sounds. Reporters who had begun to gather quickly shielded their cameras as the wind forced them to look away. Marco's command center showed each step in real time. The blackout grid held steady. The operatives secured the child. The shooter was neutralized without force. Blaine's access to his radio was already dead. His badge number removed from the network. His presence erased as though he never arrived at the scene. He stood motionless, unable to understand how the world had shifted beneath him so fast. Officers around him asked if he was all right, but he didn't answer. The fear building behind his eyes was not about the shot he fired. It was about the realization that he had shot someone whose death triggered a system so powerful that even the police chief could not interfere. Jake Morales stepped back as two more operatives lifted Elena's body with a reverence usually reserved for soldiers lost in combat. They covered her with a flag they carried specifically for Omega Sentinel extractions. A flag stained with history and sacrifice. Jake wanted to speak, to tell them she deserved more than a silent removal, but the look in their eyes told him they already knew. One operative paused long enough to nod at Jake, a silent acknowledgement of the 30 seconds he had recorded before the suits arrived. A courtesy, a warning, a confirmation that nothing about this moment would remain in civilian hands. The helicopters landed in a synchronized formation that shook the ground. Mia was placed inside the first aircraft, strapped in beside a medic whose movements were careful and gentle, as if handling something far more fragile than blood and bone. She cried out for her mother, but the medic rested a hand on her shoulder and whispered words too soft for anyone else to hear. Blaine stepped forward as if to object, but the nearest operative looked at him with a quiet finality that stopped him cold. The officer's world, authority, confidence, control, collapsed under that single stare. He reached once more for his radio, but it remained dead in his hand, stripped of purpose. The men loading Elena's body into the second helicopter did so with a precision that made every watching officer realize they were no longer in charge of the scene. They were bystanders, spectators, witnesses to a handover that carried the weight of military authority far above their rank, as the helicopters lifted off. The wind flattened the crime scene tape one last time. Officers shielded their faces from the force. Jake watched silently, knowing the video on his phone was the only unclassified record of what had happened. In the command center, Marco stood with his hands braced on the console, breathing through the weight of grief and duty colliding in his chest. His sister's death had activated a system designed to expose truth, eliminate interference, and protect whatever remained of her legacy. Omega Sentinel was no longer a protocol. It was now a storm moving across Texas with a single purpose. Nothing would stop it, nothing would slow it, and for the people responsible for her death. The reckoning had already begun. Jake Morales uploaded the 30-second video at 7:14 p.m., hitting post with a steady hand, even though his stomach churned with the knowledge that nothing in his life would be the same after this decision. The first 1,000 views arrived in minutes, then 10,000, then 1,000,000, and by sunrise. More than 28 million people had watched Officer Derek Blaine fire a bullet into the chest of a decorated Army surgeon in front of her daughter. The video spread across every platform, amplified by veterans who recognized the insignia on Elena's sleeve and civilians who felt a sense of outrage that pulsed through the country like electricity. Jake never added commentary. He didn't need to. The image spoke with a power that could not be softened, justified, or denied. Meanwhile, the blackout around the VA lot had ended, but the damage was already irreversible. Reporters began tracing Elena's identity online, digging into publicly available records until they uncovered fragments of a career most Americans never knew existed. When classified files leaked onto independent servers at midnight, the fragments became a full picture. The documents revealed that Dr. Elena Sofia Ramirez had saved 187 lives across 3 Afghanistan tours, performed surgery in collapsed buildings while rockets fell around her, refused medical evacuation twice, and once held a severed artery closed with her bare fingers until help arrived. She had been quietly awarded the Star of Valor, a medal rarely bestowed and even more rarely discussed. The leak painted her not as a statistic, but as a hero whose final moment was caught on video in the country she served. Veterans flooded the internet with their own stories of her, naming her Doc Ramirez, Guardian 72, the surgeon who stayed behind, and the smartest hands in the desert. Each story added weight to the outrage, shifting the public mood from shock to fury. While the nation watched the video on screens across living rooms, buses, and break rooms, Mia Ramirez sat in a secure room on base with her stuffed bear held to her chest. Inside the bear, as Elena once told her, was a journal meant for a day she hoped would never come. Mia unzipped the seam and pulled out the folded pages, her small hands trembling. The letter inside carried her mother's handwriting, steady and clear. "If they ever kill me for my skin on American soil," Elena had written. "Stay silent just long enough for the truth to arrive. Then scream." Mia read the line 3 times before placing the journal against her heart, a child understanding too soon that her life had shifted into something vast and irreversible. Mia's silence was not compliance. It was preparation. She watched the adults around her whisper into phones, trade files, and coordinate movements with expressions that carried the gravity of national consequence. She felt her mother's voice inside the words she held. And she waited. At the Dallas Police Department. Lieutenant Sofia Reyes sat in her office with her face lit only by the glow of her computer screen. She had been Elena's classmate in high school, the girl who used to sit beside her in chemistry and trade jokes about which colleges would take them farthest from their rough neighborhoods. Sofia had chosen policing because she believed in serving the community. Elena had chosen medicine because she believed in saving lives. Their paths had diverged, but their friendship had not. when Sophia watched the viral clip. Her heart lurched as if someone had grabbed her by the throat. She pulled up Officer Derek Blaine's personnel file, which she had accessed many times over the years. 4 brutality complaints hidden under insufficient evidence. 3 use-of-force violations quietly reassigned to training mishaps. 2 internal investigations sealed under Chief Harlan Voss's directive, and then the incident from 18 months ago, the one Sophia personally brought forward with documentation and photos, buried in the system as though it had never existed. She realized Blaine's violence was not a mistake. It was a pattern protected from the top. Sophia opened her encrypted drive and began gathering every file she had ever tried to submit, every complaint she had ever signed, every video timestamp she had ever verified. She uploaded the entire archive to a neutral external platform with a single click. The files went live at 6:11 a.m. within minutes. Reporters were reading through the documents, connecting dates, and identifying the cover-ups that had shielded Blaine for years. By mid-morning, downtown Dallas erupted. Protesters filled the streets with a determination that left no room for denial or delay. Signs bearing Elena's name were lifted alongside military patches from units she had once healed. Crowds chanted not only for justice, but for accountability across the chain of command. Veterans marched shoulder to shoulder with nurses, students, and clergy. The police line formed quickly, but officers found themselves staring at a public no longer willing to accept silence. City officials attempted to calm the situation by releasing a brief statement claiming the shooting was under review, but the public rejected the message instantly. They had seen the video. They had read the files. They knew what under review meant. It meant delay. It meant denial. It meant the truth buried under paperwork, just as it had been for years. Then Jake Morales, still shaken from the night before, posted a longer version of the clip from his body cam patch. The footage showed Elena's hands raised, her voice calm, and her daughter standing directly beside her at the moment Blaine fired. It captured Blaine's contempt, his refusal to look at her identification, and his complete disregard for Mia's presence. The extended footage shifted public fury from outrage to something deeper: betrayal. If this could happen to a decorated surgeon, it could happen to anyone. Across the city, phones rang in offices with increasing urgency. Politicians scrambled to craft statements. Reporters fought for sources. Attorneys prepared for immediate litigation. And Chief Voss, sitting behind his desk in a room lined with plaques he no longer felt worthy of, watched as the foundations of his department began to crack in real time. He understood the consequences long before his staff entered with demands for statements he could not give. He had buried Blaine's complaints. He had protected him. And now, the country knew. As the morning stretched into noon, Sophia Reyes stepped to a podium outside the department, her voice steady but firm as she announced her whistleblower leak in front of cameras. She stated plainly that the department had suppressed multiple warnings about Blaine, that she had personally attempted to report misconduct, and that leadership had chosen silence over accountability. Her words pierced the city like a second explosion. Meanwhile, on the secure military base, Mia sat with her mother's journal open in her lap as a colonel knelt before her. He told her in calm tones that the country now knew what happened. The truth had arrived. Mia closed the journal with a quiet resolve her age could not soften, and for the first time since the shot that took everything from her, she finally let herself breathe, because the world had begun to scream for her mother, and it would not stop. 11-year-old Mia Ramirez walked into the Senate hearing room with a calm that unsettled every adult who watched her take those slow, steady steps toward the microphone. She wore her mother's dog tag tucked under her collar, the same piece of metal that had awakened Omega Sentinel only days earlier, in her small hands. She carried the blood-stained rank insignia that had been removed from Elena's uniform during the extraction. She placed it gently on the table in front of the senators, her fingertips hovering over it for a moment before she pulled her hand back. The room held its breath as she looked up, her voice soft but clear as she said, "This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice." Her words struck with the kind of weight no child should ever have to carry, and yet she delivered them with a composure that made the senators sit straighter, as if recognizing the responsibility they had in front of them. Senator Maya Delgado leaned forward with a steady expression, ready to guide her through the questions that would expose not only what happened in the parking lot, but the years of misconduct beneath it. Delgado had built her reputation on holding power accountable, and she saw in Mia the dignity and quiet fire Elena once carried on battlefields. The hearing cameras captured every second, broadcasting nationwide as Mia described how her mother identified herself, offered her military ID, and stood between Blaine and a frightened child before the officer fired without warning. No dramatics, no embellishment, just the truth spoken with the clarity of someone who had lived through the moment. Senator Delgado shifted to the data next, releasing 8 years of records she and her staff had gathered overnight from both public and whistleblower sources. She explained that under Chief Harlan Voss and Mayor Lydia Grant, 64.2% of all misconduct complaints within the Dallas Police Department had been dismissed without proper investigation. She read the numbers aloud, each statistic unfolding like another page of a story the public was hearing for the first time. Excessive force complaints buried, racial profiling reports ignored, officers reassigned rather than disciplined, civilian footage overwritten, body cam malfunctions that occurred only when certain officers were involved. And the darkest revelation of all, Blaine had been protected through every incident. His record cleared repeatedly under the signatures of Voss and his internal affairs captain. Delgado displayed the sealed files Sofia Reyes had leaked, showing the pattern of violence stretching back nearly a decade. Each document shown on the screen carried the weight of a system that had chosen silence over responsibility, and each revelation tightened the grip of public outrage across the country. As the hearing continued, the Senate gallery filled with veterans wearing patches from Elena's units. 1st Med Group, Omega Medic, Guardian Task Force. They watched without speaking, their expressions firm and resolute. Many had known Elena, many had served beside her, and all understood the magnitude of what had been taken. When Delgado announced that Blaine would be taken into federal custody before the day ended, the veterans lowered their heads, recognizing the solemnity of the moment. On the streets outside, crowds gathered around large screens, watching the hearing live. Some held signs with Elena's name, others held photographs of the flag she had worn. All waited for the accountability they had been denied for far too long. Back inside the hearing room, the final portion of testimony shook the nation. Delgado called for the arrest of Officer Derek Blaine on charges including unlawful killing, civil rights violations, falsification of records, and aggravated endangerment of a minor. Cameras captured Blaine in the brief moment before federal agents reached him. He stood frozen in the hallway outside the chamber, his face pale, eyes wide with the realization that the shield he had relied on for years had shattered. When the agents placed cuffs on his wrists, he muttered something no microphone picked up, but one agent later described it as a quiet plea that collapsed into a whisper. The walk down the corridor became a national moment, an image of accountability many believed they would never see. By midday, the video of his arrest had been viewed more than 60 million times. Blaine's wife filed for divorce before the sun set, leaving a public statement that simply read, "I feared this day would come," while Blaine faced the consequences. Chief Harlan Voss sat alone in his office, staring at the letter that had been delivered that morning. It was written in the steady hand of his younger brother, Corporal Benjamin Voss, who had served alongside Elena in Fallujah. Inside the letter, Benjamin described the day Elena saved his life by refusing to evacuate after a mortar strike. She had carried him under fire, sealed his wounds, and demanded he hold on long enough to meet his newborn daughter. Benjamin wrote that he owed his entire future to her courage. Then his words shifted, revealing his shame at learning what his brother had allowed, how Voss had buried complaints against Blaine, covered evidence, and created the environment that led to Elena's death. The letter ended with a sentence that pierced Voss with more force than any reprimand. "You let the woman who saved me die under the shield you were supposed to uphold." Hours later, Voss swallowed a bottle of pills in his home, leaving behind a confession that named every internal cover-up, every manipulated report, and every officer he had protected despite misconduct. His death did not undo the damage he caused, but it opened the door for investigators to retrieve the truth he had concealed for nearly 2 decades. Mayor Lydia Grant watched the hearing from her private office in City Hall, her face tight with the fear she had kept hidden for years. She had built her political rise on promises of law and order. But behind the scenes, she had accepted private security donations to bury cases that made the city look unstable. Elena's death had become the match that ignited the entire structure. As the Senate hearing closed, Delgado ended with a sentence that would echo across the country. The death of Dr. Elena Ramirez is not an isolated tragedy. It is the result of a deliberate system. And today, that system begins to answer for its choices. The moment the gavel struck, the hearing broadcast cut to live footage outside the Dallas Police Department. Residents lined the streets, chanting Elena's name. Veterans saluted the image of her insignia displayed on the building's screens. And as the nation watched, a sense of reckoning swept through Dallas, carrying the weight of justice that had been denied for too long. Mia sat with Senator Delgado in a quiet room afterward, clutching her mother's journal. The senator placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, telling her, "Your voice changed the country today." Mia nodded quietly, the dog tag warm against her skin. She understood now that her mother's final words written on the page were not a prediction. They were a promise, and the world had begun to fulfill it. Mayor Lydia Grant's downfall began with a soft knock on her door and a single envelope placed on her polished desk. An envelope carrying evidence she could no longer outrun. Inside were financial disclosures she had buried, private security donations disguised as community grants, and emails proving she had approved the suppression of multiple brutality cases, including the earliest complaints against Derek Blaine. For years, she had justified her decisions as necessary for maintaining public order, convincing herself that silence preserved stability. But now the silence she cultivated had turned into a blade pressed against her own future. As national outrage swelled, journalists tore apart her record with the same precision she once used to protect it. Every platform replayed the footage of Elena's shooting beside charts outlining how Lydia's administration dismissed or delayed investigations that threatened her political image. The pressure crushed her carefully built persona. Her approval rating collapsed overnight, donors withdrew support, and even her closest advisors distanced themselves, hesitant to be tied to a scandal that now carried federal scrutiny. She tried to issue a statement claiming she had been misled by those beneath her, but the public knew better. The documents Sofia Reyes leaked showed Lydia's signature on every buried case. Her political masks had peeled off, leaving only the truth. She had made a career by prioritizing her own survival over the lives harmed by her inaction. By the end of the week, she resigned, escorted from City Hall through a back exit to avoid the cameras. She retreated to a rented home in the New Mexico desert, far from the power she once wielded, living under a name that now meant nothing in the world she abandoned. Her disappearance became a symbol of what silence ultimately costs: reputation, legacy, and the illusion of moral authority. Meanwhile, Derek Blaine faced a justice no one believed possible only weeks earlier. The courtroom was filled to capacity the day he was sentenced, not with jeering crowds but with quiet veterans who carried a steady, unbreakable resolve. They sat shoulder to shoulder, representing every unit Elena had served. The judge read the charges with a calm heaviness, outlining each count of unlawful killing, civil rights violation, falsified reporting, and endangerment of a child. Blaine stood with his hands cuffed, jaw trembling as he listened to the consequences he could no longer escape. There was no plea for mercy, no attempt to argue justification. The evidence was overwhelming. The video Jake recorded played one final time before sentencing. The sound of the fatal shot echoing through the courtroom with a severity that made several spectators bow their heads. Blaine's attorney kept his hand on the officer's arm, knowing there was nothing to be gained by protest when the judge delivered the sentence. Life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Blaine's knees buckled slightly. His breath hitched in a shallow gasp. The reality sinking in that the uniform he once hid behind now held no protection. The courtroom remained silent, not out of sympathy, but out of respect for the woman he had taken from the world. After the hearing, a guard handed Blaine an envelope that had arrived at the courthouse earlier. Inside was a drawing made by Mia, sent through an advocate who believed he should see it. The picture showed an American flag torn down the middle, and beneath it were 3 handwritten words: "You broke it." Blaine held the drawing for a long moment, the weight of those words sinking deeper than any sentence the judge could offer. While Blaine's fate moved forward in the justice system, another chapter closed in grim finality. Chief Harlan Voss was laid to rest in a private ceremony attended by only 6 people, none of whom wore the uniforms he once commanded. His death by overdose had shocked the department, though many quietly acknowledged that he saw no path forward as the truth of his misconduct unraveled. Investigators found letters in his home that confessed to decades of suppressed complaints, including multiple cases tied to Blaine. His notes detailed how he justified his actions over the years, claiming he believed protecting officers from public backlash preserved morale and stability. But those words rang hollow to the families harmed by his silence. Voss's funeral was modest and quiet, conducted without honor guard, patrol vehicles, or a flag presentation. The department declined ceremonial observances, citing the severity of his admitted misconduct. Only his daughter, 2 cousins, and 3 former colleagues attended, standing in a small half-circle as the minister read a brief prayer. There were no speeches, no praise, no recollections of service. His coffin was lowered into the ground with the same quiet finality that marked his final weeks in the days following. The department announced a full audit of every decision he had signed across his career, making clear that his legacy would be revisited not with respect, but with scrutiny. Across Texas and beyond, reactions continued to ripple from Elena's death. Veterans held vigils in her honor, gathering in silence before reading her service citations aloud. Nurses shared stories of working beside her in makeshift clinics overseas. Military journals published pieces detailing the rare level of courage Elena had displayed across her career, emphasizing the magnitude of talent and heart the country had lost. The phrase "cost of silence" began circulating among community groups, referring not only to the silence of leadership, but to the culture that allowed officers like Blaine to operate without consequences for so long. Families affected by police misconduct came forward with renewed courage, citing Elena's story as the catalyst that gave them strength to demand accountability and across the nation. Parents spoke to their children about the role of integrity, using Elena's name in conversations about bravery, sacrifice, and the cost of standing for truth. In a small, secure building on base, Mia sat with Marco and Senator Delgado as they reviewed the next steps. Her face carried a mixture of grief and resolve. the kind seen only in children who had grown up too fast. She held her mother's journal in her lap. Tracing Elena's handwriting with her fingers while listening to discussions, she was too young to fully understand, but too connected to ignore. Delgado told her gently. "Your mother changed the world even after she was gone," Marco added, "and you helped her do it." Mia didn't speak. She simply nodded, her grief shifting slowly into a quiet, steady strength. The nation was beginning to move forward, but something in her understood that her mother's story was not only about loss, it was also about exposure, accountability, and the danger of silence. And in her small, steady heartbeat, the world could feel the first embers of the legacy Elena had left behind. Major General Harlan Thorpe stood before the cameras with a solemn weight in his posture. A weight earned over decades of service and quiet battles fought in rooms the public never saw. And when he removed his uniform coat and placed his 4 stars on the desk in front of him, the nation understood that something irreversible was taking place. His voice carried the steady cadence of a man who had lost soldiers under his command. But the tremor beneath it revealed the personal grief he carried for Elena Ramirez, the surgeon who had once saved his life after an explosion in Kandahar. He looked directly into the cameras and stated, "We will no longer train alongside any agency that treats our people as threats." The sentence rippled across the country with a force that silenced every commentator and left military leadership stunned. Thorpe continued, outlining the painful truth he had kept quiet for years, that too many service members returned home only to face suspicion and danger on the soil they defended. He spoke Elena's name with reverence, recounting the night she held his chest closed with her own hands while waiting for a medic unit to break through the chaos. "If she had died overseas," he said softly, "it would have been an honorable loss. But she died here, at home, because those sworn to protect failed to recognize the very people who protect them." His resignation was immediate, his stars left on the table as a sign of protest. And by the end of the broadcast, millions of Americans were calling it the most powerful act of moral courage since the end of the Gulf War. In Washington, the Department of Defense moved faster than anyone expected. A coalition of senior officers, senators, legal advisors, and veteran advocates drafted a directive that had been buried in classified proposals for years. Now, in the wake of Elena's death, the directive resurfaced as an urgent necessity. It became known as DoD Directive 73 Omega. The policy outlined a simple but radical protection. If a veteran or active duty service member was unlawfully attacked by civilian authorities, they were authorized to respond with immediate force to protect themselves and any civilians present. The directive did not undermine civilian law enforcement, but clarified that military personnel would never again stand defenseless in the face of unlawful violence. The language was firm, precise, and backed by decades of cases in which veterans had been harmed during routine encounters. The signing ceremony took place behind closed doors, but Senator Delgado later referenced the moment in a press briefing, describing it as a safeguard carved out of the blood of someone who gave everything for this country. The directive passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, turning Elena's death into a legal and moral turning point. Across bases nationwide, commanding officers gathered their troops to explain the new protections, many speaking Elena's name in classrooms and auditoriums as an example of why the directive mattered. At the same time, communities across the country began calling for reforms inspired directly by Elena's legacy. Hospitals created new protocols for responding to veteran crises. Police academies introduced mandatory military awareness training. State legislatures drafted bills requiring independent oversight when a service member was involved in any police encounter. Veterans groups organized panels where military families could speak openly about fears they had carried for years. In these meetings, one name appeared again and again: Elena Ramirez. the surgeon whose death had forced a national reckoning. Her story became a symbol of both the fragility and the strength of those returning from war. A reminder that sacrifice did not end at the border of a conflict zone, while legislation moved forward. Marco Ramirez carried the burden of grief alongside the responsibility of shaping how his sister's legacy would be honored. At Fort Cavazos, he established the Elena Ramirez Scholarship, a full-ride program offering 72 scholarships every year to minority military children, the number chosen in honor of Elena's call sign, Sentinel 72. The scholarship became one of the most rapidly funded programs in Texas history. Veterans, families, and community members donated from across the nation, leaving messages describing how Elena's story had changed their understanding of service and sacrifice. Some wrote about their own fears as parents of children in uniform. Others wrote about the quiet courage of the soldiers they had known. Marco read every message, his heart heavy but strengthened by the knowledge that Elena's life continued to reach people far beyond her final moment. On the day the scholarship was announced, Mia stood beside Marco, holding her mother's folded flag to her chest, her chin lifted with the quiet strength Elena had taught her. A reporter asked Mia how she felt knowing the scholarship bore her mother's name. Mia answered softly, "It means other kids will grow because my mom believed in hers." The room fell silent, and even the cameras seemed to record with gentler movements. Across the country, police departments felt the ripple effect of the reforms. Some resisted the changes, arguing that they threatened authority. But most departments quickly realized the tide had shifted. Cities that once ignored misconduct now faced demands for transparency. Police chiefs who refused reform found themselves pressured to resign. Members of Congress introduced oversight measures tying federal funding to departments that implemented veteran safety protocols. And as politicians debated the finer details, the public remained united behind one truth. The death of Dr. Elena Ramirez had revealed a dangerous gap between military service and civilian policing, a gap the country could no longer afford to ignore. Major General Thorpe, now a civilian living quietly outside Fort Cavazos, received letters daily from service members thanking him for his resignation speech. Some wrote that his words had restored faith they thought they lost. Others said they finally felt acknowledged by a system that had overlooked their struggles for too long. Thorpe read every letter with a sense of responsibility he refused to take lightly. He never regretted stepping down. To him, the stars were symbols of authority, symbols he no longer wanted, while a soldier he admired lay buried because her own country couldn't see past its prejudice. He kept one object on his desk, a photograph of Elena standing in a field hospital, her hands covered in dust, her eyes steady with that familiar look of quiet determination. Below the frame, he placed one of his stars, not as a display of rank, but as a tribute to the woman who had earned his loyalty long before he wore them. The reforms, the directives, the hearings, and the public outcry all shared one unshakable truth. A nation had been forced to confront its failure, and in doing so, it began to change. Elena's name was now spoken in military halls, legislative chambers, classrooms, and kitchen tables. Her sacrifice had become a guidepost, a reminder that justice does not arrive on its own. It must be demanded, shaped, and carried forward. And though she was gone, the movement she inspired continued to grow, rooted in the belief that a soldier's life carried value not only on distant battlefields, but at home, where they deserved the same protection they once offered the country. 1 year after the shot that changed the country, the induction field at the West Texas Military Academy stood filled with 3,000 cadets standing in formation, each one wearing the crisp uniform of a young person preparing to serve. And at the center of the field stood 11-year-old Mia Ramirez, holding the folded flag that once rested on her mother's casket. She stepped forward with a composure that drew the eyes of every student, instructor, and officer present. The commandant invited her to address the assembly, but Mia did not speak right away. She placed the flag carefully on the wooden podium, rested her hands against the edge, and lifted her eyes toward the cadets with a quiet strength far beyond her years. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, carrying the weight of an entire year of grief, memory, and growth. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to ask this academy, and everyone listening, to give 1 minute of silence for someone who served this country with everything she had. The field, the officers, the watching families, every person within hearing distance." Fell into immediate stillness, no murmurs, no shifting feet, no wandering eyes. The silence felt like a living presence moving through every row, binding them together in a moment too heavy to ignore. Mia closed her eyes, pressing her thumb lightly against the dog tag beneath her collar, the same hidden stud she had pressed on the day her mother died. But this time, the gesture was one of remembrance, not survival. The minutes stretched on, long enough to let the weight of Elena's sacrifice settle into the hearts of everyone present. And when the minute ended, Mia opened her eyes and spoke into the stillness with a clarity that carried across the entire field. "For those who protect us," she said, each word rising with a strength that felt larger than her small frame, and without hesitation, 3,000 voices answered as one. "For those who protect us." The sound rolled across the grounds with a power that struck even the most senior officers with emotion. After the call echoed into silence, Mia continued speaking, her tone calm but grounded with purpose. She thanked the Academy for honoring her mother's name, but she also spoke of what came after, how the country had changed, how lives were saved, and how reforms were born not from anger, but from truth. She talked about the scholarship bearing her mother's name, about the children who had already received full rides, and about the letters Marco had read to her from families Elena's legacy had touched. She spoke of Major General Thorpe leaving his stars on the desk, of the directive signed in her mother's honor, and of the veterans who wrote to her saying Elena gave them hope even after her death. She did not cry as she said these things. Her voice never wavered. She carried herself the way Elena once taught her, with dignity, gratitude, and unwavering clarity. When she finished, the commandant stepped forward and saluted her, a gesture normally reserved for military personnel. And the cadets followed with a united salute that turned the moment into something sacred. Mia returned the salute with a small nod, knowing her mother would have told her to stand tall and accept the respect she had earned. Later that afternoon, Mia walked with Marco to a quiet room inside the academy, where she had been asked to sign a commemorative plaque bearing Elena's photograph and service timeline. The plaque would hang in the academy's Hall of Honor. Mia signed her name beneath the inscription that read, "In memory of Colonel Elena Sofia Ramirez, Sentinel 72, a protector at home and abroad." She pressed her palm gently against the glass frame for a moment, whispering words only she could hear. Marco stood behind her, hands clasped, allowing her the space to feel whatever she needed to feel. When she turned back to him, her expression carried the same quiet bravery Elena used to wear on the long nights overseas. Marco placed an arm around her shoulders, telling her that her mother would be proud, and Mia leaned into him for a brief second before stepping forward again. She had learned that grief does not vanish. It reshapes itself into something a person learns to carry. Across the country, Elena's legacy continued to deepen. Her photograph, the one captured by Eden Park, titled The Triangle, showing Mia clutching the folded flag in the shape of a perfect triangle, hung in every American military installation. Beneath it, a single line was engraved, "Never again." The image had become more than a photograph. It had become a promise. Soldiers saluted it before deployments, Veterans touched the frame during ceremonies. Cadets studied it during ethics classes. It held the weight of a nation's vow to protect its own protectors. And though it was only an image, it carried the force of a movement born from the life and death of a woman who had given everything she had, even in her final breath, to shield her child. As evening settled at the academy, the commandant invited Mia and Marco to a small gathering with instructors and scholarship recipients. They spoke quietly about their goals, their families, and the new opportunities Elena's scholarship had given them. Many of the students told Mia they wanted to serve because of her mother's example. Mia listened with a solemn politeness, her eyes bright with understanding that Elena's story was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to the country now. When the gathering ended, Mia returned to the field with the folded flag in her hands. She stood alone for a moment, looking out at the empty rows where the cadets had stood earlier. She whispered, "I did it, Mom." Then she lifted the flag to her chest and took a deep breath. The lights across campus dimmed, and Marco called to her gently. But Mia asked for one more minute before leaving. She bowed her head in quiet reflection, letting the still air settle around her, carrying her mother's memory with a tenderness shaped by the year she had endured. When she finally walked toward Marco, she did so with a confident stride, as if every step carried a piece of Elena's strength. The country had changed, laws had shifted, and leaders had fallen, but none of it compared to the legacy that moved forward in the small frame of a child who learned to speak truth in a world that once refused to hear it. And as she left the field with Marco beside her, the story of Dr. Elena Sofia Ramirez lived on, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point carved into the heart of a nation determined to honor those who protect it. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps.